this is Tiffany, and you're listening to Everything Fab Four on Salon.com.
Welcome to Everything Fab Four, a podcast focused on fun and intelligent stories about the enduring cultural influence of the Beatles. I'm your host, Ken Womack, music culture columnist for Salon.com and a Beatles scholar and historian. No other band, or popular phenomenon for that matter, has enjoyed the global impact the Beatles have, and continue to have more than 50 years later. They are part of our human fabric. They created music that continues to bring people together, and just about everyone has their own Beatles story to tell, some that are surprisingly deep and unexpected. This show seeks to draw those stories out in interesting and insightful ways. Remember, it's a Beatles world, and everyone has a story.
Maybe a little like the Brits who were studying American music and appreciating it more even than the Americans, American rock and roll. Like the Beatles, they heard stuff in American rock and roll that Americans were taken for granted at that time. And they said, wow, this is, they did their impression of it really. And they were freely admitted it. That was the great part.
Today's guest is musician Paul Shaffer. For 33 years, Paul served as David Letterman's musical director and sidekick. Paul began his career in 1972 as musical director of the Toronto production of Godspell. He played piano in The Magic Show on Broadway in 1974, then spent the next 5 years with the original Saturday Night Live, where he played keyboards, composed special musical material, and in 1980 became a featured performer. In 1977, he took a break from the show to star in the CBS comedy series A Year at the Top, produced by Norman Lear and Don Kirshner. After his return to Saturday Night Live, he collaborated with Gilda Radner on the songs for her Broadway show, in which he also appeared. He served as musical director for the Blues Brothers, John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd, for their triple platinum album and national tour. His guest starring television appearances include Ed, The Sopranos, Law & Order: Criminal Intent, Schitt's Creek, and How I Met Your Mother. Paul also starred with Bill Murray in the Emmy-nominated Netflix special A Very Murray Christmas, for which he also served as musical director. In addition to recording his own albums, Coast to Coast and The World's Most Dangerous Party, Shaffer recorded with such diverse artists as Diana Ross, Yoko Ono, and Robert Plant's Honey Drippers. His feature film roles include Artie Fufkin in Rob Reiner's This Is Spinal Tap. Shaffer has served as musical director and producer for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony since its inception in 1986. He was Paul McCartney's musical director for the Concert for New York and appeared with Faith Hill on the America A Tribute to Heroes telethon, both of which honored and raised money for victims of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. Paul is also the author of the best-selling memoir, We'll Be Here for the Rest of Our Lives. Welcome, Paul Shaffer.
Now, your love of the Beatles goes way back, doesn't it?
Well, of course, in that I am an ancient gentleman now who was around, to see that first Ed Sullivan appearance, which I watched with my family, because that was the kind of show that the Ed Sullivan Show was, something for everybody. Now, if you'd like, I can do the full Ed Sullivan introduction.
Please.
As him. Well, yesterday and today, our theater has been jammed with newspapermen and photographers from around the country. And these veterans agree with me that the city has never seen the kind of excitement generated by these four youngsters from Liverpool who call themselves the Beatles. Now, tonight you'll twice be entertained by them. And then of course, he introduces them from there. But I love the phrase, you'll twice be entertained by them. Friend of mine says it's sort of like, twice refried beans or something, twice fried, something like that.
It was such an odd turn of phrase.
Yes. And of course, a journalist. Ed was a journalist introducing the Beatles from that point of view. Newspapermen have all agree with me.
Well, surely then it's so when you saw that performance, was it clear that was this life-changing for you?
Well, I'll tell you the truth, and you may kick me off the podcast when you hear me say this. Airplane going by. But to tell I had been watching Sullivan show and way up in Canada, northern Canada, Thunder Bay, where I'm growing up. At that time, it was called Fort William, Ontario, a remote outpost, really. But we got the Ed Sullivan. We only got one channel, the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, very much like the stodgy BBC that we hear about in Britain. But it carried Sullivan. And that's why he was always saying, well, obviously you're too young to remember. But he's always saying, now for you folks in Canada, and he had a comedy team, Wayne and Schuster. Now, Wayne and Schuster from Canada, he was always taking care of the Canadians, because he knew he was on up there. But I started to see these rock and roll acts that he had, the American acts. Jackie Wilson knocked me out. And the Four Seasons, that really, that sound and how they looked and presentation on stage, I was already reeling from them. In Canada, maybe we were a little like the Brits in that we loved American music. I was loving American rock and roll. My God, what there was there, Bo Diddley, so much of it, on that terribly influential Sullivan show. Except that I could also, after dark, I could tune in American radio stations and hear WLS, big 50,000 watts out of Chicago, with Dick Biondi, the famous screaming DJ from there, and stuff. So I was starting to hear American R&B and stuff, and man, just loving it. And the Beatles, were, of course, all guitars. And I really didn't, confession, full disclosure, didn't quite understand them yet. When I listened to those all guitars of I Want to Hold Your Hand, my God, what John Lennon's playing on the rhythm, kills me. But I wasn't, I wasn't hip enough to understand these things at the time. Then, of course, when they got their music got so sophisticated into the Rubber Soul era, and even before, I started to get it.
Mm. So, but for you though, if I remember correctly, a big breakthrough was Nat King Cole.
Well, seeing him in Las Vegas, if that's what you're referring to, my parents took me to Las Vegas as a child. I must have been about 12. It was before the Kennedy assassination, certainly. I know that because one of the acts that I forced my dad to take us to was Von Meter, the guy who made a whole career out of doing an impression out of JFK. So it was obviously before the assassination, but that's when we saw Nat Cole. And my dad was a great appreciator of the great jazz singers. Nat King Cole was his favorite. But again, I have this weird photographic memory. I can recite this great speech that Nat did at the end of his show because he had a single out in the rock era. He had a song called Ramblin' Rose, Ramblin' Rose. Why you rambling? Why you ramble? Heaven knows. Anyway, he said, "This, ladies and gentlemen, at this point, this is Las Vegas, of course. At this point in the show, a performer would very often do his what is commonly referred to as his hit song, but that in many circles would be referred to as milking the audience, and you people have already been milked enough at the tables." Yeah, that was very influential to me. I said, I got to get to Vegas. Oh, there. Oh, there you are. I lost you for a second. Anyway, that wasn't the same type of influence, though, as the Four Seasons. That, galvanized me. Nat Cole was, of course, my dad's music. My dad turned me on to Ray Charles, too. On Sundays, this conservative lawyer up in northern Canada would listen to Billy Eckstine and Ray Charles and stuff, and of course that seeped in.
Were you already playing the keyboards by this point?
I started taking piano lessons at age 6 because my mother said that kid's going to play the piano. It's the last thing he does, and she her view was, if he's in school, if you're learning English, how to read English, you can learn how to read music. Of course, they start kids even earlier, but I don't know. I think 6 was around the right time for me. And I was taking classical lessons and playing my scales and arpeggios and stuff. And then I started to hear rock and roll and started to figure out, songs on the piano, just like a kid would on guitar, in his garage. Chords, learning the chords and stuff, parallel to learning classical piano. Also learning rock and roll, the 3 chords of rock and roll, and how you could play every song at that time anyway with just those 3 chords. And then learning the 4th chord, everybody will know what I'm talking about, your fans. I was doing it by ear, and then kind of starting to relate it to the lessons. Oh, it's all the same, really, it was sort of revelatory for me.
So how do you go from your mother insisting that you will learn the piano to getting a degree in sociology? How do those two things mesh?
I just didn't know what I was going to do. Passionate about music, but too far-fetched to, as a Northern Canadian resident, to be saying, yeah, I'm going to be a piano player. It didn't make sense. And Canadians, as you may know, very pessimistic, besides being so polite. Yeah, who do you think you are, eh? You'll never make it, eh? That kind of thing. And so I went to college, and my dad would have loved me to, take over his law firm, but I didn't feel that. I thought maybe, I'd find some kind of straight profession. Maybe I might have been a teacher, or like a university professor or something. I could have gone that direction. I didn't know. All I knew was that I was very unhappy and depressed, and especially first year. And then second year, I started playing avant-garde jazz with this guy that I met in the street named Tasiji Munoz, and I'm still playing with him and recording with him to this day because he was he was originally a New Yorker. He came back to New York. He was in Toronto at that time where I was going to school. And that's really what said, when he started laying some knowledge on me, and I started to be able to hear beyond rock and roll and, some of those changes, from the music that my dad used to, some of those Billy Eckstine changes, I started to say, gee, maybe I could, and that's when I really decided I got to get out of this University of Toronto and get on my way.
And so then you go to New York.
Well, first I spent some time in Toronto playing music in that scene. Um, Not too long before, one of the things that I did, which was to accompany people for auditions and be a kind of a vocal coach and accompanist, that came natural, especially if somebody wanted to play a song that I knew by ear. And this 70s rock musical off Broadway show called Godspell, so successful that they were opening companies in different countries all over the world, and they were opening one in Toronto. A couple of girlfriends that I knew who were, one I was involved with romantically, the other just a friend. Both were auditioning for this show, and I went to accompany them both. And Stephen Schwartz, now the composer of Wicked, but at that time Godspell was his first show. He was in Toronto casting it. And after I played for these two girls, he said, "I want to talk to that piano player." And he hired me that very day to play the show in Toronto. And then after it was done, he brought me into New York. He got me my first visa, and I played for him on Broadway, 1974, a show called The Magic Show. And that's what got me into the USA. Um, and before I knew it, another year went by, and a bunch of Canadians came to town to do the Saturday Night Live show. Lorne Michaels from Toronto and his musical director, Howard Shore. I had just met Howard in Toronto before I left town, and he knew I was in town, so I got hired on SNL. And, then I spent my time trying to sneak on camera.
And succeeded on a number of occasions.
Indeed, and to the degree that I became in the fifth season what they called a featured player, whereby a certain number of shows I would be in a couple of sketches besides playing in the band. Uh, and at that time, I developed an impression of the great music publisher who had a show, the first rock concert, live rock and roll on television, Don Kirshner's rock concert. And I used to do Don Kirshner, a fast-talking record publishing guy from New York who slowed way down and froze up on camera. And I would do him on SNL. And that led to, getting into a couple of other sketches and things.
It was such an interesting period, right? You've got Kirshner and then the Midnight Special. It's just a lot of wonderful things happening in music and rock in particular. Um, I'm always interested in SNL has such a Canadian flavor and origin story, doesn't it? So many folks, this American creation really it originates in Canada.
A lot of people ask me often about, why are so many influential comics coming from Canada? Certainly, that's the reason right there, though. Lorne, a Canadian, was always tuned into who are the performers up there. When he started SNL, I've read more recently, in his autobiography, actually, he said, Gilda, who technically was from Detroit, Michigan, but was up there with a boyfriend and stuff, had ended up in Toronto and working up there in theater, came in, and he had seen her in that Godspell show that I was playing piano in, and he was impressed by her, and he said, "Well, I'll start with her." Built the company around her, and that apparently what he did. And then, of course, he came in contact with Aykroyd, also a Canadian. Um, and I think, it was so cold up there that we had to stay in and just watch American TV, or at least the shows that were carried on the CBC where I was from, and just, learn about it and study it. Maybe a little like the Brits who were studying American music and appreciating it more even than the Americans, American rock and roll. Like the Beatles, they heard stuff in American rock and roll that Americans were taken for granted at that time. They said, "Wow, this is," they did their impression of it really, and they were freely admitted it. That was the great part.
Well, of course, SNL had its early Beatles moments with Lorne offering the absurd uh, fee, and then later George and Paul Simon.
Pretty funny. Yeah. Now I was in California doing something else at that time. I missed the George and Paul Simon show. I was watching it on TV actually from my hotel room. I remember that so well, but very funny when he said, I don't care if you want to give Ringo less, that's up to you. Uh, Lorne was an all-time Beatles and Stones fan, Lorne Michaels.
So, how about Mr. Letterman? Was he a big Beatles fan?
Well, who wasn't? Of course he was. Um, he mentioned, and I think he did. He was famously a weatherman in Indianapolis. He may have done some radio DJing too, and he did mention the Beach Boys, how important their music was to him. When the Beatles came on the scene, that knocked everybody else off, except the Beach Boys and Four Seasons were, put up a pretty good fight against the British invasion. And
So,
Paul Revere and the Raiders had to dress up in costumes to do it. But their records were awfully good too. They stand up. Everybody trying to do the Beatles in their own way, of course.
well, we're still trying to catch up, aren't we, in some ways?
British, I'm amazed. And maybe I say this too much, but here I was already kind of into the American acts that preceded the Beatles. But that was me. When I got here, so many of the American musicians that I love and respect, guys even older than I, in some cases, some of the innovators, when they say the same thing. When I saw the Beatles on Sullivan, that's when I picked. I switched to guitar. Whatever it was, and I say, weren't you into music before that? But boy, they were those Beatles amazing, and guys like Kirshner and the record execs that I've come in contact with, they say, well, if you didn't have the Beatles, you didn't have nothing at that time. And the different people, who have been accused of having passed on the Beatles because they didn't hear it. That would have been me. I would have, if I had been an A&R man at Decca in Britain, I would have passed on them.
Yeah, guitar groups are on their way out.
Yes, that's right. Well, I'm worried about that now. Kids, do kids know what guitars are anymore? The
Oh,
guitar
they
groups may
do.
be on their way out.
I teach I actually have a dual appointment in English and popular music, and my music students, many guitarists. It's enjoying quite a renaissance at the moment.
Amazing.
It's
Great.
wonderful, and they, of course, um, their interest is so interesting to me because it's not about um, you know those cultural moments in the 60s, but about how they made the music. That's what they want to know is how did the Beatles do that, right? They want to
Yeah.
lift up the hood and find out how things were structured. How did they record under such constraints?
And of course, they were inventing the ways to do these things for the first time. Uh, that making them up, figure, whether it be the engineer or the producer or them, however, the technicians were figuring out for the first time how to give these boys what they want. I want to put a sound on my, voice, would say John Lennon would say, and all that stuff. They'd make it happen.
Problem solving.
But
Yeah.
for the very first, amazing. And now if we want to sample it, we get that, we can grab it for, with a sampler like that and take advantage of it, and we'll have all of that. Make a record out of that. But that's the time when they were inventing this stuff.
So how does the collaboration with Letterman begin? How does that come about?
It depends on if we want to talk in the present tense or the past. I got confused. It comes about. It came about because I had done those first 5 years of SNL as not only a musician, but then a little bit of acting too, if you could call it that. And Letterman had seen some of the things that I had done, and he mentioned in our meeting uh, that he, especially when I would work with Bill Murray. Uh,
I have to tell you, the first thing I ever saw on SNL was you playing keyboards behind his lounge act.
so I was a part of a team, a team of 4 or 5 writers that we would get together and write those things with him. He would always be responsible for what songs he was going to do, though. He just had a knack for knowing what he would. Sometimes something would, I've been singing this all week, and then he would make it funny for the show. But anyway,
Or, oh my God, when he would do Star Wars.
well, that may have been his biggest hit. And it was a Star Wars movie, this was 1977 or so, or eight. Carrie Fisher was the host of the show that week. Star Wars was so big everywhere, and then for him to do that on that very week. Anyway, Letterman said in the meeting, I've seen some of those things in the Bill Murray thing. He mentioned it. I was going to say that right after SNL fifth season ended, and everybody left, and I left too. Didn't know the value of a gig at that time. I was so young, Imagine leaving. Uh, but I got a call from Letterman, management company back then. He's doing a show in the morning live and wants you to be the band leader. And I passed on it. It just didn't, as he liked to say so later, I couldn't get up that early. But it just didn't seem, I don't know, coming off SNL, and I thought, oh, I got other things to do. I can't believe it now. Maybe should have taken it, but did pass on it. It was truly too hip for the room because I was watching it, and especially after they got canceled, they got so funny because they didn't give a damn anymore, and they still had to do it like a month's worth of show. Anyway, he still remained under contract with NBC, and they gave him another show. And called me again. This time it was going to be so late. We was follow Johnny Carson at 12:30, and I said that's more like it. And I came in. I was lucky enough that they gave me a second chance. I came in. That's when I met Letterman personally, and that's how the whole thing. And we hit it off. Obviously, we were just together the other day doing a thing in Canada.
And the world's most dangerous band, right? How did you put the band together?
Yes, he named it though. Dave Letterman took that name after, I think, something from the world of wrestling. Well, may have been the world's most dangerous wrestler at one point. But yeah, I mean, my job was to put a band together, and it should be 4 pieces. Now, I read later, I didn't realize it or know it at the time, but apparently Johnny Carson, who controlled this time slot after him, said, you can't have things that I have. We got to have a different show. You can't have my guests. You can't have Dom DeLuise. Well, that didn't bother Dave too much. He ended up having, even more interesting guests than that, and off the wall of human interest guests. And then band, I have a swinging big band. You got to have a small band, 4 pieces. That was perfect for me because I had rock and roll bands as a kid. The 4 pieces was great. And I hired 3 guys that I had been working with in New York as a SNL exposure. I became what I really wanted to be, a studio player. That to me was the hippest, and I was not first call, but I was getting work in the studios and met these great guys, and actually had produced a band that they had together, my three sidemen. They were called the 24th Street Band. Steve Jordan, Will Lee, Hiram Bullock. They had Cliff Carter on keyboard. I couldn't hire Cliff because I could have four, you know. But that's where the guys came from, and they knew they could play any kind of music, but they knew rock and roll like I did, and they didn't condescend to play rock and roll like some of the older studio guys. You know, they loved it like I did, and they could play songs by ear at the drop of the hat, and that's what had so much fun doing in the early days.
You know, that was the part that I loved. And at the time, I was in the orchestra, played French horn, and of course, toiled at that for a long time, as one does with that instrument. But I remember watching you on the show and just loving the fact that it didn't matter what genre or style you played, that everything was cool. It could be a Disney song, it could be a country song, it could be a Beatles song, it could be prog rock. You guys didn't care. And you just loved music. And it really opened up my mind to not thinking about music as having to fit inside, some kind of hip equation.
Well, thanks for saying that. You know, I recently did a jazz, a college gig, Oklahoma, University of Oklahoma. And I played there with my jazz mentor, whom I mentioned, Tuskegee Munoz. And we have a totally avant-garde jazz album out called Quantum Blues. But anyway, when you do a college, you got to do certain other things, maybe a clinic, and and I did a Q&A in the morning with their students, their jazz department, and one of the questions I thought was so insightful. How did you get around? It was something like, how did you get around the coolness factor, the fact that so much of the music that you played was not cool at all.
Yeah.
And I just said, you know what? I never worried about that. I wasn't that cool, really, but I sure knew what I loved, and I just loved top 40 radio. I didn't care what was cool. When I heard the Four Seasons, I still dig Big Girls Don't Cry. That's not that cool, really, by anybody's standards, except the people that are still paying to see Frankie Valli. But
Well,
you
the
know,
Beatles, the
I
Beatles.
sure didn't. I didn't care when I heard. I mean, I had the influence of my dad's love of jazz, and when I heard avant-garde stuff in Toronto, I was attracted to it. I'm not sure why, but I was attracted to cool stuff, but also attracted to the squarest stuff you can imagine. Loved it
My,
all. You know what? Ray Charles comes to mind. I read a quote of Ray Charles. He said, "Every music has its beauty. Don't basically say, not in these words, but he was basically saying, don't try to funk up music, try to play it right. Every style has its beauty." So maybe that, that didn't inspire me as a kid, but when I read it, I said, "Oh my goodness, he's so right."
Everything Fab Four is presented by Salon.com, the premier news, politics, innovation, and arts website. For more information, visit everythingfab4.com, where you can learn more about our podcast and my latest Beatles-related book, Living the Beatles Legend, The Untold Story of Mal Evans. The Everything Fab Four theme song, Seize the Day, is provided courtesy of Black Rabbit, the high-octane Beatles cover band, an innovative psychedelic rock project from Rockaway Beach, Queens in New York City. Like what you heard today on Everything Fab Four? Be sure to subscribe, give us a rating, and recommend the show to your friends. Plus, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at EF4 Podcast. Distributed by Salon.com, Everything Fab Four is a Wonderwall production. Remember, it's a Beatles world, and everyone has a story.